Previously, we used Graphics Builder's automatic binding to connect a breaker component in our one-line diagram. However, there are situations where this isn't sufficient. Let's look at a few of these cases and how we can override the automatic parameters. First, let's see how the automatic binding works. If I click on a component in my diagram, I can see that the name of the component at the top has been set to my breaker's equipment name. This is critical to the automatic operation of the breaker. Below that, I can see a bottom bus name and top bus name pointing to my buses as expected. Digging a little deeper into the conditions object, there are a few custom parameters here. Active condition, earth switch condition, rack position condition, and trip condition. These determine the graphical status of the breaker. The most important is active condition. This is a Boolean expression that, when true, causes the breaker to close and pass the energized bus status from one side to the other. If this component had an earth switch, the earth switch condition would control when it is open and closed. Rack position condition will cause the center section to disappear when the breaker is racked out. Finally, trip condition will show a trip indicator in the breaker when the trip status is active. This is where the automatic configuration comes in. If my component has the name field set to the fully qualified equipment name and the conditions are blank, the one-line engine will search the equipment for the system standard item names to fill the parameters out in runtime. That is, as long as my equipment uses a standard breaker device profile, or at least uses the standard tags, I don't have to fill out any of these conditions. Now for our special cases, let's look at an easy one first. If I need to change my component's linked equipment, all I have to do is change its name parameter. In my case, maybe I mixed up the positions of my utility and generator breakers. I can click the component, find the correct equipment in my binding pane, and simply click it. This automatically sets the component's name. There's also something to be wary of. If you're ever browsing the binding pane with a component selected, you can accidentally overwrite the name. However, what if my device is not a smart breaker at all? What if instead I'm reading digital inputs from an electrical meter as my breaker? What if I'm binding the input breaker of a UPS? The ideal situation for digital inputs is that you've used functional addressing to create a concentrated breaker equipment in your database, and I will have videos on this process. If you weren't able to do that, you could also manually enter the 4 conditions the same way we did for source components. Let me add an empty breaker component beneath my generator and connect it to the buses. I'll go ahead and bind the active condition to input 1 of my generator meter. Since my device is not a breaker equipment, I will need to show all equipment in the tree. I'll set the other 3 to static values to earth switch open, racked in, and not tripped. Also note that I can use other logical conditions here. If I need to invert my input logic, I can set the breaker to be closed when the input is not equal to 1. This is how you can override the automatic binding in your breaker components. I'm going to delete this and continue building my one line as before because my project is built to support the automatic methods. Next, we'll perform the final steps in configuring our one line engine. Until then, thank you.